All right, guys, welcome to Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. This is the first episode here of this show, and the plan going forward, tentatively, is to do a broadcast like this every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have a variety of guests on. We're super excited to have Dr. Jeff Meldrum on tonight. I'm going to bring him in a minute. I'm just going to kind of intro him a little bit to those that maybe don't know who he is, although I doubt there's a lot of people. Like I was saying, Dr. Meldrum is a professor of anthropology and anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He's an expert in foot morphology and primate locomotion, and he's obviously very well known for his research into the field of Sasquatch. So he's been on everything from Joe Rogan to the Discovery Channel and everything in between, dozens of documentaries and TV programs, including literary works, a very excellent book he's written in the past as well, which was, I think, paired with a Discovery program. We can talk about that. And he's spoken across North America and the world at a variety of conferences. So without further ado, let's bring Dr. Meldrum in. Hey, how you doing?
I'm great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the program. And just
before we
get started, I've been a fan of you since I was a little kid. I mean, I grew up watching you on the various TV programs in the late 90s and into the 2000s, and I was a big fan of your book, and overall I've been following your work for a while. So it's an honor to have you on the program, of course.
Well, thanks. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah. So I gave you a little bit of a bio, but do you maybe want to go into a little bit more detail about just your personal and professional background in terms of your training?
Sure. Well, my doctorate is in anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology, which means my sort of bread and butter job is teaching human anatomy in the health professions programs here at Idaho State University. But then my research focuses on the evolution of hominin bipedalism, as you mentioned, I believe, and how it is we came to exhibit the particular adaptations that we have for the habit of walking on two legs. It sets us apart from the other primates that we know of, at least, on this planet. Therefore, I mean, it's from that perspective that my interest in Sasquatch came really into focus, was here's an opportunity to examine another example, another species that shares that rather otherwise singular adaptation. And whenever you have an opportunity to compare and contrast different species, it enlightens and emphasizes the distinctions and similarities, and commonalities. And so as a student of human bipedalism, my interest in Sasquatch isn't just a lark. It isn't just an avocation that I try to justify by whatever means, but it really is part and parcel. It's central to my research program.
Yeah. Basically, you're very well known in the Sasquatch community, of course, as you mentioned. A lot of people have perhaps heard this story, but what was the incident, or was there something that kind of brought you into this in the field of Sasquatch? If you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, right, and yeah, some probably have heard this ad nauseum, but it bears repeating, I guess. My initial exposure to the subject of Sasquatch came when I was a youngster living in Spokane, Washington, and it was right about that time that Roger and Bob had captured this 60 seconds of film footage in Northern California, and they'd had their showings to the scientific community in Canada and the United States, and now we're taking it to the public. And Roger, I believe it was the premier U.S. public showing, was at the Spokane Coliseum in Spokane, Washington, and the kids at school were talking about this story, and an article had already appeared in Reader's Digest before, highlighting it was, I think, the condensation of or condensed version of the Argosy article. And the kids at school were talking about it, and I remember running home and looking at the ad in the paper and finding that and convincing my dad that he had to take us to that night. So my brother and I were there with my dad on the third row the Spokane Coliseum watching this film, and I was mesmerized, captivated, and one thing led to another. The next year, in the next grade, sixth grade, I think it was, we did a unit on primates, and as it turns out, I was able to do a report, my research report on Sasquatch, as one example of a primate, along with another classmate, and that led to kind of a funny incident. It turns out that eventually, my first public presentation in on this subject as an academic occurred up at Harrison Hot Springs, the home of John Green. And I had, for that report in sixth grade, I was at a bit of a loss as to where I'm going to find resources and references. I had Roger Patterson's little book that I'd purchased on sale at the premiere of his documentary showing the film clip. But beyond that, and a few other clippings I'd managed to dig up, through my own sleuthing, it was pretty thin. And my teacher, to her credit, said, "Well, you go and talk to your librarian." Well, it turns out, just to make the long story short, that librarian turned out to be the niece of John Green.
Ah.
So she had a freshly minted copy of On the Track of the Sasquatch that he had sent her,
Wow.
as well as quite a clippings file of her own on the subject. And so it was just amazing. So when I had the opportunity to actually meet John and actually spend the weekend at his house during the course of that conference, we discovered that fact, and he was just beside himself. He immediately picked up the phone, dials his niece, Mary Bessiker, and she still remembered that, the first student that she had loaned that book out to, and we had a fun time. It was just a small world. It was really quite amazing.
Yeah.
Well, that sort of, set the ball in motion. That planted many of the seeds. Some of them laid dormant. Some of them sprouted and led to various undertakings and researches and so forth. But ultimately, at some point, after a rather circuitous route, I ended up in the field of physical anthropology and focusing on human locomotion as my research topic. And so that set me up in a very advantageous way to be able to evaluate what is by far the most ubiquitous, the most prolific data set, which is the footprints, really, the most objective too. And so here we are, all these decades later and hundreds of footprint casts later. And so it's been quite a journey. Someone mused on the Facebook just today. I noticed they said to them publicly, but asking themselves, posing the question, I wonder if Dr. Meldrum has any self-doubts after all these years of focusing his career, risking his career, and I just wrote back, no self-doubts. I'm more confident, more convinced. I'm a little bit dismayed at some of the directions, ideas and theories and conspiracy notions have led the Bigfoot community. That's kind of frustrating and distracting sometimes, and certainly a disservice, in my opinion, a disservice to the serious objective consideration of the question, is there a biological species behind the legend of Sasquatch?
Wow. Yeah, it's funny. We're getting comments, people saying, the entire chat went quiet because everyone was just so mesmerized with that story.
Oh.
Very interesting story. I mean, it seems as if you've been sort of on a parallel path, both professionally and with Sasquatch in a way, and they've merged at times and are now sort of fully fused, I guess you could say.
Right. Yeah, and as a young academic, you've got to be kind of guarded and careful about topics that are considered controversial and unorthodox. And so it was always kind of nibbling around the edges in a way, or behind closed doors. But there was always a lot of conversation and discussion behind the scenes. I don't think people realize. I think sometimes people look at me as if I'm this crazy person, this lone voice in the wilderness, wearing my camel skin smock and eating locust and honey. but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, working with people on manuscripts and doing, as in my role as editor of the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, it gives me ample opportunities to interact with people who otherwise are not publicly or visibly involved with the subject. But when approached, and when I solicit their services, their academic, professional courtesy to render a review or a comment, 9 times out of 10, literally, they're quite willing and quite eager, quite intrigued by the whole premise of this peer-reviewed publication devoted to the question of are we alone, or are other species of hominins sharing the planet with us even today?
Yeah, and I think many of us in this community obviously commend you for some of the work and sort of sticking your neck out in a way that maybe a lot of people wouldn't. And that's something I did want to ask you about. Was we're aware of Dr. Grover Krantz, who kind of had a famous statement where he said something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, how is your Sasquatch research tolerated by your university? Say, well, I haven't been fired, something along those lines. So has there been a point where you sort of felt any kind of, not repercussion necessarily, but doubts about, perhaps, I know you said you hadn't had any doubts about the subject, but anything professionally that perhaps you felt could have done differently?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, yeah. With 2020 hindsight, I don't know anyone that's honest with herself that couldn't imagine things having gone a little differently, regardless of what they're involved with. I sometimes wonder, what would my academic career, what shape would it have taken had I never been invited to examine that, that piece of video footage from the redwoods, and had I not made that weekend trip to Grover Krantz's lab on a lark in that case, and been just overwhelmed by the impression left by an examination of the actual, oftentimes original footprint casts in his collection, or having had the opportunity shortly thereafter on the return drive from visiting his lab, is when my brother and I paid a visit to Wes Summerlin and Paul Freeman in Walla Walla, and examined even more original footprint cast material, and were taken into the field and shown a long line of tracks that Paul Freeman had just discovered, which, at the time it was like, oh, this is a coincidence. What are the odds that, how could he have possibly known that we were coming? Well, he couldn't have. There's no way he could have prepared this in anticipation, especially given the weather conditions. He could never have counted on them persisting long enough for me to have seen them. It was just the serendipity of that event really set the hook, because I'm a terrible fisherman, I have to admit. I'll catch a fish in the first 5 or 10 minutes, I get bored, and I have to get, now I can sit in one place a lot longer than I could when I was younger.
Right.
Get up and move somewhere else. And so it was kind of like that in a way. By analogy, this first event was catching a whopper, and man, I was hooked. When you lean down and you see skin ridge detail still in the prints, even talking about it makes the hair stand up on my arms and my neck, because the realization sets in that a Sasquatch actually walked right by here last night. And it was kind of that, one of those aha moments. I always compare it to the emotions in the M&M commercial, when Santa Claus turns around and there's the 2 M&Ms, and they do exist. I just
That's
about
great.
passed out, with the realization that, my gosh, there's there really is something to this. And because even at that point, I have to admit, as intrigued as I was by the sequence of events that led to paying that visit to Krantz and stopping in, dropping in unexpectedly on Paul Freeman, I had been given an earful by other people about the personality flaws of Paul Freeman, for example, and so forth and so forth. And I was quite skeptical, went into it with a very skeptical eye. And so it wasn't, like I was looking for validation or anything like that. I mean, I was trying to get to the bottom of it. I was trying to see what there was to this. And man, that string of tracks was just, because I could see all the animation. There was no way that Paul had strapped on some stompers and trotted down across the mud and left these tracks. They were the signs of animation, the obvious movements of the toes, their extension and flexion, and the drag-ins and the tension cracks and pressure ridges and so forth that were just, and as I mentioned, skin ridge detail that was evident, clearly evident at the time we first arrived there. Unfortunately, the weather was iffy, and precipitation and overcast, and by the time we got back, some of those finer details were already obliterated, but we were able to document quite a number of examples of casts to capture the range of variation that was clearly evident in those specimens. And man, to this day, I can pull that drawer open and show that set to anyone. I mean, to interested amateurs or to professional orthopedic surgeons and anthropologists and biomechanists, and they are uniformly impressed by them. It's just not, you can't just look at those and say, those were just made by fake feet.
Yeah, that's quite a story. And I remember you telling me that when I first interviewed you at the International Cryptozoology Conference in 2018, and I had not known that story actually from before, and it's supremely fascinating. So I'm going to ask you one more question here, and then I'm going to take a couple from the audience. So,
great.
Do you have a personal favorite anecdotal Sasquatch sighting or story? I mean, it can be something even that you've experienced, something that kind of sticks out in your mind as super interesting. I mean, I know anecdotal evidence is often shunned, but it's still just fascinating.
Right. Well, and as soon as you ask that, this one always pops into mind because I know the witness. We became good friends. We spent a lot of time in the field together. And her name is Julie Davis. And for those interested, if you want to see more about her account, it was featured quite prominently in a big full 2-page spread that appeared in the Denver Post, written by Theo Stein, a conservation outdoor journalist, investigative journalist. And Julie was a very accomplished amateur naturalist and hiker, backpacker, trekker. She was a goat packer. She could lay claim to having trekked the entire Continental Divide Trail through Colorado, just the state of Colorado. I mean, but even that's
impressive. Yeah, as a hiker, that's amazing.
And done it solo with only the company of goats and dogs. And on one of those stretches, she said that her dogs were acting up a little bit and were a bit antsy. She had bumped into a couple of people on the trail, and when she's out there solo, she really kind of likes the solitude of that circumstance. And so she'd bumped into a couple of people, so decided to take a break and get off trail for a while. And she looked on her map and identified some off-trail lakes and that were surrounded by a nice open meadow, and she thought that looked like a good place to investigate. So she was going off trail, and as she's going along, her dogs got even more antsy, and she was a little concerned that maybe there was a bear in the area. This was down in the South San Juans of of Colorado, and where the ghost grizzlies reside.
Very remote, yeah.
Yeah. And so at one point, she made her camp. She tried to distract herself a little bit, and the dogs and all the goats, by playing some music. So she had a recorder that she was playing, and at one point the dogs started bristling again. She didn't want them to tangle with the bear, so she grabs them by the collar, leads them into the tent, and grabs her bear spray, turns around, and the goats have crowded up. The two goats have crowded up close to the tent. And so as she stepped out, she's afraid maybe there's a bear right behind her tent. So she's all prepared. She steps out and turns around, and then standing behind her tent is a 8.5 foot tall Sasquatch at something like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, broad daylight, and in full visibility, right in the open. And to sit here, and I've heard her tell the story several times, and to different people, and but to hear her tell it firsthand and to see her physical reaction as she remembers that, that awesome, almost overpowering encounter. She said they locked eyes, and then it looked down at the goats and back at her and then back at the goats, and it seemed perplexed by these funny looking deer. I guess what you might imagine. But she said there was an instant where there was this all just subliminal. She didn't claim like there was a psychic connection or anything, but just this implicit understanding: if you don't bother me, I won't bother you.
Wow.
And she said as soon as she had that realization, she said its expression softened, and at that point, a second one peeked out from behind the first. That was a little smaller. It was standing right behind it, and she didn't know if it was a female or if it was a juvenile or what, but she said the big one was just the muscles. It were massive. It was just a massively built and bulky muscles. And as it moved, she said she could only describe it as the way a dancer would move with the fluidity of movement. Eventually, it just turned and strode back towards the tree line with the smaller one right behind it. And as it got near to the tree line, it looked back one last time and then cocked its head back and whistled and then disappeared into the tree line. So she was quite, I mean, that for her was a life-changing experience. And from then on, every spare minute she had, she was studying about the subject and going into the woods looking for evidence. And so we spent, she and I and John Mayanzinski spent a full month circumnavigating Caneos Peak in southern Colorado and looking for evidence. Unfortunately, that was right during this protracted drought period, and the productivity understory was terrible. We hardly saw any sign of bear, for example, and nothing relating to Sasquatch. We had heard one possible vocalization in the whole time. And so when you're looking for a rare animal and circumstances aren't ideal, they may have moved over to the next drainage or down to a much lower elevation where other resources are available, and you're out of luck. And that's unfortunately what happened to us on that trip, I think.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. So I think we'll hop on over to the audience here to ask a couple questions. So we have one. Ask him about Melba Ketchum's DNA study, and I'm sure you've gotten this one before, but we'll give that one a go. So that's from Rick Tavernier. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but go right ahead.
I always hate to dwell on the negative, but the short of it is, honestly and pointedly, nothing good came from that undertaking. And she's flung all sorts of accusations back at me that I'm just, of course, see, if I take object to or criticize other people's work, then it's me. I'm doing it out of jealousy. That I don't want the limelight to be taken away from me, and which is the most myopic, naive notion that anyone could adopt, because I would if I was motivated purely by that, I would stand to benefit tremendously. I'm already well established, and
Right.
well known. And if anybody brings in the corpse, then all my 30 years of effort are vindicated. So I'd be doing backflips if her study was legit. And we were very hopeful that here was what appeared to be a bona fide molecular biologist, a DNA expert, that was turning her attention to this. But we could spend several episodes just going through the behind the scenes stories of
course.
the shenanigans and misdirection and so forth. But the best, I would just rather direct the listeners to the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, RHI, which they can find at www.isu.edu//RHI. If you just Google Relic Hominoid Inquiry, you'll find it. And there's an article by Haskell Hart, who is a retired PhD chemist who went through her study with a fine-tooth comb. He was actually much more gracious in his commentary than I would have been had I been writing that review, but I'll defer to his expertise and his détente. But it pretty much lays bare the fallacy of that entire effort. The notion that these are hybrids, which then devolved into hybrids between humans and subhumans, but then it devolved at one point because a phylogeny or a minimum spanning tree in her analysis placed it closest, the unknown, which never was fully elucidated. It was a hodgepodge of DNA from various sources. Unfortunately, is what is the best estimate of what was going on. But the minimum spanning tree established the nearest neighbor as a galago, a prosimian primate. And so if that wasn't odd enough, then she, during an interview, said, and I saw the tape of it, she said, well, this struck us as very odd until we realized there was actually a giant lemur in Madagascar that only went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And so I'm thinking, wait a minute. And then she left it at that. I'm saying, well, what are you implying? That some Neolithic human because she was saying the hybridization took place some 20,000 years ago in Northern Europe. So some Neolithic French maiden somehow hooked up with a megalodopus in Madagascar 20,000 years ago, and from that spawned the Sasquatch race. I mean, it just got crazier and crazier. And I should stop, but there was the whole involvement with Justin Schmea, and I had a very intimate involvement with that fiasco as well. And it was a mess. Yeah, there's just no, the assertion that we now have DNA of the Sasquatch is just baseless. There's absolutely no justification for that allegation. And so far, there's been no redeeming virtue that has emerged from her supposed analysis. I mean, I talked to some of the, quote, co-authors of her paper, and that's a whole nother story. I mean, the fact that she supposedly bought a journal, rolled the ticker back to volume 1, page 1, and self-published her paper. The whole story, is just, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But and I lost my train of thought. The Justin Schmea involvement. I was going to say there's too many threads.
It's a long story, huh?
Yeah, it's going to get me going. I would much rather let's move on to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question from Sherry Anderson. Have you ever smelled his odor? What does it smell like?
Well, I might have. It's hard to know. I mean, I only if you go back and look John Green was really good at kind of deriving some statistics from the massive data set that he assembled back prior to the digital age. I mean, this was before the internet, so he was relying on clipping services and bibliographic research and so on. But he noted that only about 10% of the eyewitnesses claiming to have encountered a Sasquatch made any mention of noticing a smell. And so I don't think that they have a real pungent smell all the time. And I address this in my book. If you look at the biology of great apes, they're equipped with very well-developed axillary glands, sweat glands, and sternal glands. These are the apocrine sweat glands, which we have, around our face and on our chest and underarms and down our back and around the groin and the perianal region. They produce an oily sweat that very quickly that is smelly and breaks down through bacterial action and produces that pungent body odor. But that, and as I said, these are well developed in the great apes. They lack the eccrine sweat glands, the watery sweat glands that we use for thermal regulation, for evaporative cooling, to dissipate heat, body heat. And so they can become overheated more readily. But when Diane Fossey described the first time that a silverback charged her, she hunkered down in the submissive posture, and this silverback came barreling down on her and stopped cold just 2 feet short of her. But she said she was nearly bowled over by this pungent locker room smell that it was exuding because of its anxiousness, its agitation. And so just like when we're going in for an interview or standing up in public speaking and we sweat, it's a difference when you go out and play racquetball and sweat, so I think when Sasquatch do emit, if it follows that ape pattern, then when they do emit that odor, it's at times when they're aggressive or anxious or frightened or agitated in some way. So it's not a constant thing. I have been in a situation one time where, we were walking, a couple of times I can think of now, but one in particular just came to mind where we were looking for sign. We were in an area where there had recently been sightings and activity, and so we thought there was a good chance of maybe finding some trace evidence, and we were scouting for tracks along the roadways and trails and paths and so forth. And as you'd walk, you'd suddenly hit this wall of odor. My first thought was, well, it's got it, but then you'd walk through it and past it, turn around and come back, and we looked, to see if there was any carcass, any carrion. I thought maybe there's a plant, skunk cabbage or something. And we looked around and breaking leaves and smelling, could not find anything to account for that. So it's very possible, and it was that kind of a old sock from the hamper smell, that was potent enough to pick up in the breeze, but very localized. So I kind of like to think that maybe there was a Sasquatch watching us and tabs on our progress, and maybe it was a little agitated, and when we crossed its downwind draft, we'd catch a whiff of that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard monkey house smell. I mean, people have said, you go into a zoo, it's a very distinct odor when you're around the primates, wet dog, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But here's sort of a question that I think a lot of people are maybe concerned about or just interested in is, how does he feel about killing one to prove to the scientific community that they exist? This is the kill versus no kill debate.
Exactly. Well, I have to admit that I started out and I was associated with other colleagues who had the wherewithal and the inclination to collect a specimen. I wrestled. I had that intellectual rationalization, and thought about it a lot. I even talked to Grover Krantz about it, and I convinced myself to adopt that posture. Grover was convinced. He sort of had resigned himself to the realization or the recognition in his mind that the only way to resolve this once and for all with the scientific community was to lay a specimen before them. And so he felt, that the first person who shot a Sasquatch should be, hailed a hero, an explorer, and given $1 million bounty. But the second person who shot a Sasquatch should be convicted as a felon and imprisoned and fined $1 million. I mean, he just thought that would be the one event that would turn the tide of opinion and then justify their protection. And so I had rationalized that when we were out in the field, we were prepared to do that. And then the conversion came in a comical way. Took my kids to see the Disney movie Tarzan. And here were these two characters portrayed, the doting professor who's really ready and willing to give up his life and career to spend the rest of his life there living with the apes and learning about them on the one hand. And then on the other was Clayton, the guide, the nefarious guide who was out to exploit the gorillas and shot at everything that moved. And I can remember that almost as if this little imp is sitting on my shoulder whispering, "Hey, Jeff, which of those two characters are you?" And as I thought about it, I thought, what is the motivation? Is it, I've rationalized it, but is it justified? Are you justified in killing one of these magnificent creatures solely for the purpose of proving to other people, for whatever reason, whatever motivation, professional or academic or otherwise? And I had to be honest with myself, realized no, I was not justified. They did a 180-degree about face. Really quite interesting, because literally on the heels of that change, that turnaround in thinking, a graduate student down the hall from my office introduced me to John Mayenzinski, who's been a lifelong friend and mentor and research companion. And had I still been entrenched in that previous mindset, I'm sure he would have had nothing to do with me. It's not his ethic, and I'm happy to say now that it's not mine either. So no, I don't advocate that as a way to solve this question. That's why we John and I always strove ultimately to acquire DNA evidence, and we experimented with various types of hair and tissue snags and means of collecting, blood or tissue or hair in order to get the DNA, even though there isn't a precedent for recognizing a novel species on the basis of DNA alone. There is now a growing body of literature where this very question is debated, especially when it pertains to rare and endangered species. Are we justified ethically or even from a conservation point of view to especially when you're dealing with an animal that we don't understand what the potential impact on the social organization, the demography might be of collecting a specimen lethally. And it's just like when, and I may rankle some individuals with a comment like this, but when they decide there's too many wolves and the wolves need to be culled, right. It's not like that you have this homogeneous population that you're just trimming off the tail ends of the distribution. You take a wolf and you can an alpha, and you can completely disrupt the social organization of that pack, and it'll have impacts not on that one individual but on an entire group of individuals. And so you never know what the impact would be. So I think in this day and age, we should approach Sasquatch as a test case for this more enlightened approach of using a voucher specimen of DNA, a novel DNA, confirmed independently by other labs as the basis for the recognition of an unknown species, a previously unknown species. I mean, they're hardly unknown, are they? Here we're talking about them. I think lots of people know about them. They're just not recognized.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really glad that came up. I was going to ask you that regardless. If you just look at a gorilla, I mean, in the zoo, the eyes of a gorilla or a chimp, I mean, there's something so distinctly human, of course. Would you be able to kill something like that unless you absolutely have to? And I think that's a question that really people have been debating for a long time. And as you've said, even like yourself have changed opinions. So here's one that I think will be great for you. This is from my buddy Joe. Aside from the Grays Harbor cast and others collected from the Grays Harbor area or Cripplefoot, what other footprints would you recommend to somebody who has taken a strong interest in studying casts and Sasquatch foot anatomy mechanics? Now, Joe does some casting of his own, and he does some pretty great reproduction, so perfect question for him.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's like saying what's your favorite dessert. It's, and I'm often asked that when I have a display of footprint casts at a conference or convention. People will ask me, well, which is your favorite? Which one do you and which one should I get if I'm going to get one? And it's hard because each example may convey a different aspect or a different insight into the function and anatomy, the form and function of the Sasquatch foot. So, there are some examples that are just really quite typical in their appearance, presenting what the real fundamental shape and size of a Sasquatch foot is, like the Patterson 1964 from Bluff Creek above Notice Creek is a great example of that. The tracks that were cast by Bob Titmus, taken as a whole, make this extremely compelling case, but specifically the one that has the most dramatically exhibited pressure ridge, indicating the action of that mid-tarsal break that people have come to be more familiar with now. That one is fantastic, especially when you consider that, when I had the opportunity to go to China and examine some footprint casts there, that one of the witnesses, Mr. Yuan, at the Shenanjia Reserve, actually had a pair of casts that were almost identical to the casts made by Bob Titmus. And yet he had absolutely no way of being aware of that example, let alone understand the significance of that morphology and that dynamic feature. It's not really so much the morphology as the application of the morphology to the form of the footprint itself. You mentioned the Bosworth cripplefoot. I mean, those are just stunning. A great story about that one. If I have time to interject.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had bumped into a distant cousin, second or third cousin. I think we shared great-great-grandfathers or something like that, but bumped into him at college at the testing center. And just the only time I met him on campus, then he was off pursuing his medical career. But he happened to see me on one of these documentaries, and he contacted me, reached out, and he had become an orthopedic surgeon who specialized in the lower extremity. And so I said, I've always wanted someone with your training to comment on a particular set of Sasquatch tracks. And he was quite intrigued. I mean, obviously that's what had brought us back together, was seeing me on one of those documentaries. And so I sent him a very nice 8x10 black and white photo. It was taken by Renee DeHinden of the original Bosberg casts. And there happened to be 2 yardsticks lying in the frame. So the scale was quite evident. But I said, I'm going to mail this to you and just tell me what you think. Well, as soon as he got the photo, he calls me right up, and he was quite excited. He's, oh, this is really interesting. He said, the one foot looks fairly normal, except he said the heel is huge. The heel is very large and projecting. Good observation. And then he said, but the deformity is a classic. We would put it under the rubric of pes cavus. We debated that a little bit. that interpretation. I didn't quite agree that, anyway, we won't get into all the nitty gritty of it. The point was, he was quite impressed by this. And he said, if I was presented with a patient that had this condition on one side but not the other, I would, it's unlikely that it's a congenital deformity. It's something that has arisen probably as the result of a spinal cord lesion, a tumor on the spinal cord, which causes this neuropathy and results in this peripheral, deformation. He said, could you, this was a remote part of Washington, up there in northern Washington, above Bosworth, Washington. Could you maybe check with the hospital? He said, I would immediately send a patient like that for an MRI screening of the spinal cord. He said, could you go to the hospital and see if there were any patients that had, this combination of foot deformity and spinal cord lesion? And I said, well, I could, but you do realize the guy would have to have 17.5-inch feet. And there's this pregnant pause on the line. Oh, you're right. He was so taken by the anatomy, he totally overlooked the scale that was quite obvious, and just had overlooked the fact that they were enormous. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a call, and it turns out it's his attending physician, his supervisor, who actually is the foot specialist. My cousin was focusing more on hip and knee replacements, but his boss was quite interested in discussing this case with me, and he said, actually it was more than 2 weeks. It was some time later, but he had been out of town during the original time. But anyway, the point of the story was we had this lengthy conversation discussing all the possible interpretations of this pathology, and which I found fascinating. Not only was it enlightening, but I was just impressed that these footprints held their own with a expert, with a specialist in foot pathology. And he closed with this final statement. Basically, he said, I hope you don't mind, but I kind of pressed your cousin, Russell was his name, Russell, for the photo that you sent him, and I have it framed and it hangs in my office. And every time I get a new batch of interns, this is the first case I have.
Wow. That's really cool.
So when you have people quip that, they're so obviously hoaxed, someone just went to, as Dr. David Daglin would opine, just went to the medical library and opened up a book in orthopedics and traced the outline of an infant foot, which is what gave it the odd proportions of a skew foot, and used that to pattern up to make this. Well, that's quite that's a lot to assume, in my opinion.
A lot of effort to go through.
Would go through all that, to then never use them again. That one case we've got, really, essentially, and you can take that, pardon me, either way, I guess. That singularity, does that lessen the credibility, or does that increase the credibility? It's hard to imagine someone who has a set of footprints. There were those who argued that Ray Pickens had made a pair of fake feet, and he owned those fake feet publicly, and there's no comparison. I mean, they're the crudest, most ridiculous, non-anatomical contrivances that you can imagine, and they only work if you're stomping in snow. That you can't, otherwise it's like wearing snowshoes, and you cannot get any indentation in mud or sand or a shoulder of a road. And after René de Hinden and Ivan Marx, and then unfortunately the association of Ivan Marx and his reputation, which goes without saying for those that are familiar with it, that muddies the water a little bit too. But to have thousands, there were literally over 1,000 footprints that they counted up. And that's not a minor undertaking at all. But
that's quite an effort.
Yeah.
Awesome. Here's a good one from a friend of mine, Carrick, who has a channel called Crash Course Cryptozoology. Would love to know your thoughts on the Snow Walker Yeti footage. It's not the North American Sasquatch. My apologies if the question is misplaced, as there's a lack of clarity surrounding it.
That's no problem. The snow walker was that was an interest. That was one of my first exposures to the media, to the documentary world and production companies, and it was not, unfortunately, wasn't the best first experience, because there were all sorts of red flags. And for those that aren't familiar, the snow walker, the scenario that was suggested was a pair of trekkers had been dropped off somewhere, presumably in the eastern Himalayas. They never were very forthcoming with the details. And while they were hiking, they came upon some tracks in the snow, and then they were working their way up this little chute, kind of going off trail, and caught a glimpse of this creature apparently making its way down below them. And they got some film footage of it, and it retreated away from them, went up the mountainside, and disappeared. Okay, well, so we were asked, we being myself and not doctor, but Richard Greenwell, who was the secretary of the, managing secretary of the Cryptozoology, International Cryptozoology Society. And red flags went off. They wouldn't share the video with us beforehand. They were very cryptic about where it had been shot. The witnesses wished to remain anonymous. I mean, there's just one thing after another. We were promised that we'd be given the whole footage, so we'd know the context. They showed us some snippets that fed into the scenario of this being a commercial trekking. And what was interesting, and the reason I guess the red flags didn't create more skepticism on my part, we had a visiting graduate student just down the hall from me in one of the other labs from Nepal, who actually worked for one of the wildlife services there in Nepal. And so I asked him if he would take a look at it. He looked at it and said the scenery, the shot, and they had edited in stock footage of the Himalayas.
Yeah.
Which made it even more. So he said, "Oh yeah," I said, "that's very familiar." And he goes, "Oh yeah, the scenario," he said, "is very common for these European, especially trekkers. They will be helicoptered in, they'll be dropped off, they have their packs already prepared for them and everything. So they're stocked with local foods, and there were close-ups of them, lighting these funny little paraffin stoves and opening bags of flatbread and stuff that had Indian logos and labeling and so forth. I mean, it was someone had gone to some effort, is what it turned out. And so the fact that he was quite at ease with the whole context then caused me to then just focus in on what I was looking at. And the thing that threw me off was I had assumed that the trail that I could see that during one of the scenes with the Yeti kneeling or squatting beside it was the trekkers' snowshoe trackway, one walking right behind the other. So we kind of estimated what would be the minimum, if they were walking, as you do with snowshoes, you try to kind of walk, you have a little bit of a straddle, but you're going to kind of step around and walk a bit in a line. And then whoever's coming up behind, instead of breaking new trail, will step in your footprints. So there would kind of be a minimum width. And so we estimated what that was and used that as a scale. And it suggested that this creature was about 7.5 feet tall. And so obviously that was not a justified assumption that the trail was probably wider than we thought. But in any case, I eventually, and then they never would. I qualified every remark and every proposal with the caveat that, we don't know this, we don't know that, we don't know this, and we need these details before we can come to any conclusions. But of course, they just edit all that. They edit around all that. So you're making these assertive statements appear to be, and then they never would come through with the film for me. And I called and I called and I called. I was really pestering them. And finally, the one guy, I could hear the receptionist talking to the one guy, one of the owners of the production company, and he started swearing, and he's never going to get that piece of that footage. Just tell him to get blah blah blah. And I thought, this is well. Then eventually, someone did contact me and said, he said, I really feel bad about how you've been treated. I want you to know that it was hoaxed.
Yeah.
There's a new premiere show. I can't remember the name of it. Paranormal something or other with Jonathan Frakes.
Yep.
Commander, I'm not going blank. Picard's #1, and hosting it. And basically, the story went, they gave this production company a blank check and said, make us a startling, sensational piece of footage. And so they
promo
whole scenario.
And that's unfortunate.
What a way to start your my professional career. I mean, I think for the most part we tried to be very professional. But it was a great learning experience. So following that, you learn in dealing with production companies that you don't give away your hand until you have all the cards, and there's nothing that's off the record, 2, and 3, you have to be careful in anything you say, because it can be edited. I mean, edited in the sense of taken out of context, or any qualifier trimmed away to where they just leave one. I mean, we see it every day with the national news now. I mean, you just cannot, if you watch the actual briefing and then go watch the summary that the news provides for you, I mean, it's disgusting.
It's a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something as a filmmaker. I can obviously understand you have a full interview, and when it's all cut up, you can basically make the person say anything, which I think is a shame, and lots of production companies do that. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. I do have 2 questions in the chat, if you don't mind sticking around a couple more minutes, that I think you would really like. This one is fantastic, very technical. I think it's going to be right up your alley. Susie Myers asks, has there been analysis of the trackways of presumed females that would establish a morphology that would indicate the dimorphism from the pelvis that would alter the placement of the feet?
Right. That is a good question. And it ties back to some of the initial criticisms of the Patterson-Gimlin film. And one of those was one of the anthropologists, and I'm trying to remember who said it. I can't think right now exactly who said it, but his contention was, this doesn't make any sense because, and he thought it was ridiculous to have breasts, these pendulous breasts that were covered. And first of all, he said primates don't have hair-covered breasts. I don't know what rock he was living under, because that's not a valid statement whatsoever. But he said it has breasts, suggesting it's a female, and yet it walks like a man. Well, what was he getting at? Well, it didn't show the distinctions in the female gait that I think your listener's getting at, which are the result of the obstetric constraints of a widened birth canal, which separate the hip sockets farther apart. And so with each step, the torso has a tendency to tilt the pelvis to a greater degree than in males whose narrow pelvic outlet, sans a birth canal, have hips that are closer together. Okay. So the question, this anthropologist said, what we see on the film doesn't walk like a female. Well, it doesn't walk like a female human, but it walks exactly probably as we would expect a female Sasquatch, that as an adult has the brain about the relative size of a gorilla or a chimpanzee. Hence, it does not have the obstetric constraints of a large widened birth canal, creating female hips that give that delightful tilt to, and I hope that isn't taken as sexist. It's purely out of admiration for that little bit of list that we see when a female walks, as weight is supported over the support limb and the swing limb becomes airborne. There's a tendency for that pelvis, if I can get my hands in the right position, to tilt one way.
Yeah.
Muscles, we have adapted specifically our gluteus medius and minimus muscles to help lift up on the uphill side, lift up on the torso, on the pelvis, to prevent that tilt. There's a syndrome called the Trendelenburg sign that results from paralysis of the minor gluteals. And in that case, the individual is unable to counter that tilt, even the male. And so to compensate, the arm is thrown out to the side, like a tightrope walker or a slack cord walker, to move the center of gravity over, so there's less tendency for the side to tilt. So you see that in the way Patty walks in the film. She does walk like a large muscular man. She doesn't have that pelvic tilt, but I think it's because the pelvis is narrower, and so should reflect the appearance, the impression that one gets watching a male human walking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love that question. First of all, that was amazing. And correct me if I'm wrong, but males and females, at least humans, we have a completely different sense of balance, or at least for males, the balance would be the upper body. Females, it would be the hip area, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. There's that great party trick where you stand in front of the wall, and forward and lean your head against the wall, and and then try to lift the chair. And females can do it because they can stand up, lift the chair and stand away from the wall, because their center of gravity is lower. They have more mass in the lower extremities and hips and less upper body, whereas the males have more upper body, and so they're a little top heavy, and just enough that you can't. That demonstrates that very dramatically.
Yeah, I've seen so many YouTube videos of people trying to do that, and the guys will go and saying, "Oh, that looks so easy, I can do it," and then they're not able to do it.
Right.
That's great.
Very surprising to discover that little detail of anatomy.
Absolutely. So here's a good one from Brady Baxter. He's awesome. He's got a YouTube channel. Another young guy like myself getting into this. He asks, what are the repercussions of the discovery of Sasquatches, or does it cause more harm than good for the species, and are they better left off unclassified?
Right. Well, that's a hard one to predict. I mean, it's because it is a very hypothetical situation. I guess we can kind of look at precedent found in examples of other rare and endangered species that were discovered, and the impact it's had for us and for them. So take the lowland gorilla or the mountain gorilla. Mountain gorilla, for example, we had we not recognized them, there's a very good chance that they would be extinct. I mean, they're so the one in the one direction, you can't be a good steward or a good manager of something if you don't have an understanding of it, and at the very least a recognition of its existence. On the other hand, that recognition had some repercussion for Victorian Europe, European sensibilities, and the fact that there were creatures that were so similar to us caused a lot of reactions. Some of the misconception of the thesis of evolution, of human evolution. The cliche, we descended from apes. That has a sort of a misrepresentation of what we're actually referring to by descent with modification from a shared common ancestor with the extant great apes. The discovery of a creature that's perhaps even more closely related to us than any other previously known. If Sasquatch is more hominin-like, say a relic robust Australopithecine become giant, that became giant as it spread across southern Asia and into North America. That would, I think, would just shed more light on our own understanding of the evolutionary history of our physical frame. And the implications of that's a whole nother discussion, the interface between science and evolution and religion. But I don't think it's going to rewrite the textbooks. It's not going to overturn, all sorts of policies and procedures. I mean, there will be adjustments. I don't think all logging will come to a crashing halt. I think there'll be a much more concerted effort to come to an understanding. There will be resources and personnel devoted to the study of these creatures. I don't think it will suddenly become easier to find them, but it may justify the application of technologies. I mean, I've had conversations with one gentleman who at one point in his career was involved in the design of satellite surveillance. And in my efforts to look at potential applications of drones and thermal imaging has always run up against the wall of penetrance, being able to see through the forest canopy. These are, after all, wild men of the woods, not of the plains or the open places. And he assured me that, he said, Jeff, if we retasked one of these satellites and flew over your house on some Saturday morning, I could tell you what brand of cornflakes you were eating. And I go, I don't know if I want to know that. That's a little disconcerting, big brother's looking, but they're not that they would be interested in what I'm doing. But the point is, the technologies are there. Yep. Military grade technologies could be directed to a question with the proper motivation, as opposed to the limitations of commercially available technologies, be it drones and thermal imaging or whatever. LiDAR, be another possibility that if you had the resolution to actually pick out, megafauna, right, the landscape, that would be, I mean, if you can identify, I didn't get to see all of the episodes of the latest, Sasquatch Expedition or Expedition Sasquatch, but I was intrigued by the initial application of LiDAR, that they could actually pick out game trails as they wove their way through the landscape. I mean, if you can pick out that irregularity in the forest surface, if there was 8.5-foot Sasquatch standing there, I would think you could pick up that outline as well. So they didn't address that question really.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for the question, Brady. That was great. We can do just a couple more if you're game. All right. I think this one's great. You talked about, obviously, your connection with John Green. This question by the Midnight Mansion. According to John Green's Apes Among Us, areas with a lot of rainfall have more Sasquatch sightings. Any thoughts about a possible connection between Sasquatch and rain or water? And that's something I've heard as well. Very interesting. Go right ahead.
Absolutely. That John was one of the first to draw attention to that there was a very high correlation between precipitation levels and what I would say are credible, in that they're reasonable and or documented or corroborated with trace or physical evidence suggesting the presence of a population of Sasquatch. It's also interesting that same correlation ties very nicely with the distribution of black bear. And in fact, there was a paper published. One of the co-authors was an acquaintance of mine who graduated from the University of Colorado in GIS technologies, and he did his honors thesis on the geospatial distribution of Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest, and looking at a 20-year span and changes to the distribution over those 2 decades in the Western Washington and Portland, Vancouver areas. Anyway, that was an interesting. He landed a job at Esri, and now he's a senior technician in another company. But he he wrote this paper. It was actually an editorial, guest editorial, where they were looking at the what they felt was the misapplication of some of the new ecological modeling software packages. They felt researchers were using them like black boxes and just chugging in data and not understanding how the data was being treated when producing the conclusions, drawing conclusions from it. And so to demonstrate their concern, they applied these packages to ostensibly bogus data, namely Bigfoot data. And it spit out these really remarkably logical and consistent patterns of distribution that had consistent, climatic and ecological variables, parameters, which aligned remarkably closely with black bear. And so they took the position that while we have to consider this data sort of tongue in cheek, it's possible that there's a novel species that shares this remarkable alignment. We think it more likely that Sasquatch sightings are just misidentified bear sightings. And I wrote to this fellow, his name's Peter Anello, and I said, Peter, I thought you were on our side. What happened? Used to the dark side. He said, Jeff, you more than anyone should recognize, if we had written this article with the tone that we were giving serious consideration to the possibility that Sasquatch exists, it never would have been published. And I've experienced this as well with book proposals to academic presses and so forth. Even though the acquisitions editor was very delighted with the proposal that I submitted, their scientific or their advisory board said this will never get past outside peer review, because suggesting that there are relic hominoids still out there today. Anyway, so back to this. So he said, no, it was really remarkable how congruent these patterns of distribution lined up. He said, so much so, in fact, that my co-authors who started off on this project with the notion that this was just bogus data are now very intrigued by it, and they're asking all kinds of questions. He said, I have them reading your book. So black bear, and there's nothing surprising really, because you've got another large omnivore. You have to have sufficient productivity of the understory where the sugars and carbohydrates are found in the form of fruiting shrubs, basically in a temperate rainforest, in order to support an omnivorous population. And of course, there's different ways to be omnivorous, and so we can divide that omnivorous niche, subdivide it or partition it, as the ecologists like to say, niche partitioning, so that the adaptations we see in the craniodental proportions of a Sasquatch versus a bear. A bear derives from a carnivore ancestor, so its masticatory apparatus and its digestive system are derived from a carnivore, whereas a Sasquatch is almost certainly derived from a hominoid ancestor, a frugivore-folivore ancestor that has a very different chewing apparatus, different jaw proportions, and almost certainly, we don't know this for sure, but it almost goes without saying that a very capacious gut with a slow gut passage time and opportunity for hindgut fermentation and detoxification, secondary compounds of plants, maybe even coprophagy to run it through a second time and get the most from that incompletely digested roughage. All these things are behavioral aspects of other great apes, and would explain the girth. I mean, that's why Sasquatch is big. In other words, it's big because that increased size is to its benefit as an animal that has a rather poor quality diet that requires lots of digestion and slow passage time. And they're huge. You look at Patty; she's as deep from front to back as she is from side to side. This barrel chest and barrel abdomen. It just doesn't have the paunch that's so evident on a gorilla because the pelvis is shaped different. The gorilla has a pelvis that, the blades face forward and back, and so everything that's suspended from that hangs out like a big belly. But the Sasquatch, with its reshaped pelvis, more like a hominin, bipedal hominin, to get those gluteals we were talking about on the sides for balance, has a more bowl-shaped, and so the belly wouldn't look as paunch or protruding. It's just a massive torso all the way up and down.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard descriptions even of people saying it was as wide as a cow at the sides, or something along those lines, which you can imagine being confronted with something like that would be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
So here's
go ahead.
No, sorry, a question just I wanted to ask you. You've obviously been all over the world filming for various TV programs and documentaries, and I'm sure that's afforded you some amazing experiences. Is there one location or place in particular that you were taken to, either for a conference or filming wise, that kind of stands out in your mind as probably the most interesting?
Well, I think the one that was the most consequential was the trip to China, where we were afforded the opportunity to go into Hubei province, and we visited the Shenanji Reserve, and this gentleman who had been in the expeditions back in the 70s when Dr. Zhou Gujing from the Beijing University had, or I guess was, I think it was the university. It was either the university or the Museum of Natural History. I went blank here. But he led these expeditions, and they literally had hundreds of militaries supporting the expedition, that providing logistical support, but also literally beating the bushes, so to speak, looking for trace evidence for footprints and hair, interviewing the local villagers and so forth. And Mr. Yuan was one of those soldiers, and he mustered out afterward and stayed. He was so enamored with the region, stayed in that little village, and he got a job in the newly formed nature reserve, and became a warden. And it was on one of those patrols that he had an encounter, visual encounter with a Yeren, and described it walking bipedally. It was really fascinating. I put together sort of an identikit, like a police identification lineup, and I had a 3-ring binder with the plastic sheet covers with all sorts of photos from monkeys standing upright. I try to get things in bipedal postures: monkeys and apes, gorillas, bears, and as well as artistic interpretations of fossil hominids and so forth. And to see them flip through, including Mr. Yuan, he was quite fascinated with it. We first brought it out with a different witness, and he was kind of bemused and quickly flipped past the bears, like, what do you take me for? and the monkeys. And then there was this artistic reconstruction that was taken from a Russian magazine, where they had drawn a wild man, and I had colorized it and given it an orange tint. And boy, he kept coming back to that. It actually had kind of a rounded head, much more rounded. We get caught up with this notion of a prominent sagittal crest, and I think that gets overblown a little bit. And I think if you look at all the frames in Patty's, there certainly is evidence of that peaking and that prominence of the temporalis muscle joining there. But some of that you can see move. It is hair. And the hair is kind of either bouncing as she walks or standing upright, hair. If you've ever seen a chimpanzee agitated and their piloerection, it's called the erection of the hair, it makes them look bigger than they actually are. In any case, he focused on that one, and Mr. Yuan agreed. He liked the color. There was the one he saw. There was a deeper reddish brown color. In fact, I remember he pointed to the stain on the woodwork of the door jamb, and he said it was, and it looked like the very kind of ruddy brownish hue of some orangutans that you see. In any case, when Mr. Yuan, he had his, that we were going to interview him about his footprint casts, because in the wake of his sighting, he tracked the thing and found where it had apparently squatted beside a spring, and in the mud it left these two imprints very clearly, and he'd made a right and a left cast of those. We were in the bus going to the location they wanted to do the interview. They wouldn't let me see the casts at the time, but as we're passing time, I reached in my backpack and I pulled out a reprint of the paper that I published, where I named the tracks and discussed the morphology. And there was a very good figure that showed that distinctive titmus cast with the pressure ridge from 3 different views. And Mr. Yuan could not read the paper, but he could certainly see the figures. He saw that. Oh, he got excited. He stomped on that page, and I said, okay, you know, and so soon we quickly arrived, and shortly after arrived and set up, and then the cameras are rolling, and he opens up a suitcase and pulls the toweling out, and out comes his 2 casts, and my jaw just went slack because here were the titmus casts. I mean, it was just it was uncanny. I mean, that's why he got so excited, because this cast was just like his. You could have, you know, if someone wasn't as familiar with them as I am, easily confused the two. They were a little bit broader, almost the same exact length, same pressure ridge in exactly the same spot, same orientation, same details of contour that actually conform to the centers of pressure beneath the talonavicular joint and the calcaneocuboid joint that form that transverse tarsal joint combination. I mean, it was just uncanny. So, you know, you ask for a smoking gun. Here, this guy cast these years before I had ever published my interpretation of what that track was. There were not pictures of that cast readily available. There's a couple of sources, but one of them is, I mean, the principal one is in one of John Green's books, and it's, you know, in his original books, the photographs are almost like newsprint. He probably did print it on the printing presses down at the paper he owned, but I guess it was Cheen Publishing that did it. But in any case, they're what do you call it? There's a word, screened, and so they have the little dots. You know, they're very grainy. You can't see you can hardly tell that it has a pressure ridge. Point being, there's no way that Mr. Yuan could have had any inkling of that example, let alone what the significance of it was. And you would expect that very posture as the creature squatted down and the weight rocked forward onto the forefoot with the heel elevated, you know, as we would if we squatted, except we'd be up on the ball of our foot because we have a rigid arch. Their foot would collapse into flexion through the transverse tarsal joint, and it would push up a pressure ridge into the heel imprint. So it makes perfect sense. His description of the circumstances makes perfect sense.
Wow.
Go figure, huh?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the continent apart, that's amazing. I actually hadn't heard of that story before, so that's something I'm definitely going to be researching late into the night tonight.
Oh, great.
So I think we'll take one more question here from the audience. I really like this question. I think you're going to like it too. It's from JW Films 21. Are there any of Dr. Meldrum's peers or colleagues from Idaho State University now open-minded about the subject? Thanks for the question.
Yeah. Yes, there are some. Thankfully, the most vocal and vehement naysayers that made my life quite interesting at times are gone, either through attrition or through retirement. And there are several who are very open-minded, but it's interesting how the reaction to my involvement in this subject has evolved. You know, when it started off, there was real a lot of criticism, a lot of objection raised, a lot of silly remarks, silly comments. I mean, it got so bad that at one point the university president actually said in a general faculty meeting, although no names were mentioned specifically, but everyone knew who he was talking about, he emphasized the need for respect and collegiality, for acknowledging the intellectual freedoms afforded all faculty to pursue legitimate scientific questions and so forth, or legitimate questions. We've gone from that to the silent treatment. It's like, if we don't mention it, don't draw attention to it, maybe it'll go away. And I mean, everyone knows that I'm here for the long haul. I've made every effort to be professional, to be serious and objective, and to present the institution and my department and so forth in a positive light. But it has been, it did expose the underbelly of the scientific community and academia, and it is unfortunate. I mean, people, and there are lots of people who have. I'm certainly not alone in this. I mean, there are other controversial topics, and there have been many serious historians and students of the philosophy of science who've written on the, sort of, I guess you'd call it the psychology of the scientific community. And, Carlton Kuhn's books, not Carlton Kuhn's, I always slip that. Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was a classic because it pointed to this notion of how paradigms can influence the way in which we think about questions and constrain the questions we pursue. We have to be able to publish. We have to be able to get grant money. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to find ways to do both of those that are a little maybe outside of the mainstream channels, and thereby I've been able to pursue my research. But I'm trying to think of the proper metaphor. The situation is changing. Let's just say that. And here's an experience that gave me tremendous gratification. We had a visiting assistant professor in one of the departments that I work with sometimes, and she came up and she had some questions about access to certain specimens and so forth. We were visiting and getting acquainted and talking about those, and as the conversation came to a slight lull, I'll just say she graduated from a very prominent Midwestern university, an excellent anthropology program. She was a fresh PhD under a very acclaimed mentor, and she had the credentials. She says, "Can I ask a geeky question?" And I said, "Sure." She reaches down to the side of her and pulls out of her handbag, her shoulder bag rather, a copy of my book. She said, "Will you sign my book?" And
that's great.
That moment, it wasn't this. It was here's the next generation of anthropologists, and she's not indoctrinated.
That's amazing.
It's not just as a quirky avocational interest, but this is a fascinating question to her. But she realizes, and this is there's still she's still on the backside of the curve of change, because it's going to be another, maybe I'd say 10 years at least. I mentioned some of the retirements that have some of my naysayers, but there still is that whole generation that was laboring under the pre-existing paradigm that didn't allow for such things to exist. There couldn't be other hominids out there. We're the only one, is the paradigm that was prevailing. Even though that paradigm has crumbled it, like Kuhn said, it sometimes takes a whole generation to die, to pass away, retire and or die. And so there still are the department chairs, the symposia organizers, the society presidents, etc., that are the gatekeepers. That they control ultimately tenure and promotion, and many other aspects of academic life, success or in academic life. And until that changes, we're still not going to see the full open-minded reception of this question. I mean, I've got maybe another 8 to 10 years left in me. I'll probably just be on the cusp of seeing more of those changes. I mean, she's not the only one. I mean, I've encountered other people. Those rare occasions when I have the opportunity to present, say, at the physical anthropology meetings on this subject, the reaction is overwhelmingly positive. I mean, there are the naysayers, there's the curmudgeons, but there's a lot of interest, And unfortunately, they don't always, sometimes their exposure is limited to the tabloid in the supermarket checkout line, or the occasional documentary, which is why I cringe sometimes, when I see the quality of production that goes out. And as I said, this trend for the appeal to paranormal explanations, which I think, I mean, I know people are having experiences, often very subjective experiences. I'm kind of a wet blanket, I guess, because whenever I tag along, they don't happen. So I tend to think it's more of a resignation, since I quote as an investigator, in their words, or let me just say it so it's not confused, because I don't want people to think I'm saying this. They say, since they can't explain why there's no bones, they can't get the picture, they can't get this or that, there's not the definitive, then it must be something abnormal or paranormal. And then in come the portals and interdimensional travel and quantum physics and all these other hypotheses that have no objective documentation, period. I mean, I pressed someone who kept talking about orbs. So I said, send me your best picture of orbs, because he acknowledged that he had pictures. So he sent me a picture. It was a flash photo taken at night in a ponderosa pine forest during pollen season. There was bits of pollen. I mean, I've been out in this circumstance, when you go out of the tent with your headlamp on, it looks like a blizzard.
Yeah.
Almost seeing things because all this light gets diffracted by all these little pollen grains. Those were his orbs. So, I'm sure people will say, but they're, they have the real orb experience, but show me a picture.
Right. There's always the but.
Yeah. So it's like, this will date me, but you may have seen it in some flashbacks. There was a hamburger commercial that became, pop culture. The little old lady who opens up the bun, and there's this itty bitty wimpy patty. She says, "Where's the beef?" That became a meme before we had the word meme for anything that didn't produce what it promised. It never stood up to scrutiny. And so, to all those out there who have experience with orbs and interdimensional portals and everything, I say, show me the beef.
Yeah, the bold claims require bold evidence.
Sure, or just any evidence. I mean, it doesn't even have to be bold. I never really quite bought into. It was Carl Sagan who said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Any claim just requires good objective documentation, good evidence, and I don't think you have to hold it to a higher standard. I mean, if anything, if things are too expected, too conventional, we may lower our standards. But and that shouldn't happen either. I mean, even that should be held to the same rigors of scientific scrutiny. I mean, it's unsettling. There have been papers published. The one that comes to mind was actually in the biomedical sciences, but they go back through previous years of publications, and they find anywhere from 60 to 80% of published results are subsequently proven to be inaccurate.
Amazing.
You know, so if that applies in any degree to the natural sciences, you know, then how reliable are people's observations and conclusions? And so, you know, that puts just a greater burden on us as scientists and even citizen science to be objective and parsimonious in our interpretation of our experiences, and not just throw everything under the sun onto the internet. Yeah. Well, anyway, sorry.
No problem. I'm sure we could spend all night here talking about these topics, and I really appreciate you coming on and spending a little extra time with us too, and just addressing people's questions. I mean, we had some fantastic questions. Thank you to everyone who asked a question. Couldn't get to all of them. There was a lot, but I think we covered most of the ground that I had in my notes for questions that I was going to ask anyway. I figured they would have been asked, so that's great. Is there anything else you want to say in conclusion about where people can find out more about some of where to find you and what's going on next, if you have any projects or anything like that?
Well, I don't have a web page per se. I mean, I usually try to direct people to the relic hominoid inquiry and support that.
I'll put the link to that in the description.
That would be great. And but otherwise, you know, my book is a good place to start in the vein of citizen science. I've also written a couple of field guides, which have become quite popular and helpful. The first one is available at REI stores across the country, but they're both available on the Paradise K webpage or Amazon. The first one, there's two. The first one looks specifically at Sasquatch. It's kind of a how to identify, to discriminate, to document, to report evidence as a citizen scientist. The second one casts the net a little more broadly. It's actually kind of a shrunken head of the next book project that I'm working on slowly, glacially. But it casts the net more broadly and poses that question: are there other relic hominoids? You know, what's the relationship of Sasquatch to the Yeti, or the you know, the Homo floresiensis, the orang pendek, or, you know, we talked about the Russian almas and etc. And are there other branches of this bushy hominoid tree that have persisted into the present with us?
Yeah, and that's fantastic. I was trying to find my. I actually have both of your guides. I was going to see if I could hold it up, but I must have put it somewhere else. Yeah, that's so interesting, and that's something I think even as, you know, just a young man, when I was a kid, some of the stuff that we were learning about the family tree, so to speak, of Homo sapiens, how different it was even just 20 years ago as to what it is now, and it's constantly changing.
Right. Yeah, more and more. You know, they've done studies to estimate how replete is the fossil record in representing past diversity of different species, and, you know, it obviously it's going to vary depending on the natural history parameters of a given group of species, but it's been estimated that we've only discovered about 8 to 12% of the fossil primate species that have existed in the past. And so, you know, we're up to between 25 and 30 hominin species. If that were to hold, and I don't think it does, I think, you know, again, when you have a large-bodied, longer-lived organisms like great apes or hominins, I think the parameters are a little different. But even if you went conservative, and if we double the number that we have now, and what's yet to be discovered, we keep finding things that are closer and closer and closer to the present. You know, Homo floresiensis, they have Neanderthals that are between 10 and 20,000 years old. They have Homo heidelbergensis that are, 20,000 years old. They dredged up a jaw of a Homo erectus off the coast of Taiwan in a fisherman's net and dated it to about 12,000 years old. 12,000 years. I mean, that's just, they were building pyramids, at that point, and they were still
Amazing.
just tromping around in the islands of Southeast Asia.
That's just incredible. So we've got a long way to go. And I just want to say again, thank you for everything you've done for the subject. I mean, people like myself have been watching you for so long and reading your content. I think people are going to be really excited. I'm seeing already comments about the new book. So people are definitely looking forward to that. And thank you again for coming on the program. And
Pleasure.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in. We capped it around 260 viewers, which I think is pretty good for a first-time stream. Next weekend, next Monday will be Ken Gerhard will be coming on, cryptozoologist. He's going to talk about Bigfoot, and we'll talk about other cryptids, basically anything that kind of comes up. So lots to look forward to with the program. And again, thanks, Jeff, and thank you to everyone listening. And hope you guys have a good rest of your night here, and please stay safe in these trying times and hold your loved ones close.
Great.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.